Extinction is the most irreversible and tragic of all environmental calamities. With each plant and animal species that disappears, a precious part of creation is erased.
Michael Soule.
Biodiversity.
Biodiversity is the variability among living organisms from all sources, including terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems and their ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems.
Aspects being covered.
Overexploitation.
Overexploitation occurs when so many individuals are removed that a population can no longer sustain itself in the wild without intervention. It has been a major contributor in the decline of land-based species over the last 50 years, and the primary driver of biodiversity loss in marine systems.
Ways of overexploitation.
For instance, let's take the example of this white tiger. Overexploitation threatens 1/3 of endangered vertebrates. The illegal trade in wildlife is valued at $10 billion per year. Industries responsible for this include the trade in bushmeat, the trade in Chinese medicine, and the fur trade. Moving on, currently 12 million hectares of forests are cleared annually. Medicinal plants like ginseng are disappearing at a high speed. Up to 80% of people in developing countries are totally dependent on herbal drugs, and over 25% of prescribed medicines in developed countries are derived from wild plant species.
One of the main ways to stop overexploitation at the source is to create national parks. These parks are set up to protect native species. Inside these parks, many of the activities that lead to overexploitation and land degradation are illegal. By doing this, overexploitation levels will decrease greatly. Furthermore, there need to be tighter policies regarding the exploitation of natural resources. In this regard, WWF has been very successful, since it works with stakeholders to reform how fisheries are managed globally, focusing on sustainable practices that conserve ecosystems.
Invasive species.
When an animal, plant, or microbe moves into a new area, it can affect the resident species in several different ways. New species can parasitize or predate upon residents, hybridize with them, compete with them for food, bring unfamiliar diseases, modify habitats, or disrupt important interaction.
How are invasive species introduced? This is the American chestnut tree. A fungal infection affected this tree that had a devastating economic and social impact on eastern United States. These trees were almost eliminated from their forest habitats. It was a disaster for many animals that were highly adapted to live in forests dominated by these tree species. An invasive species uses resources that were previously unavailable for native species. For example, this barbed goat grass was introduced to California. Plant populations on those soils tended to show low density, but goat grass formed dense stands and crowded out native species that had poorly adapted to these soils.
This approach reassociates natural enemies with the invader causing problems. Natural enemies like predators, parasites, and pathogens have been used most commonly in this technique. An example of biological control is the release of parasitic wasps to control aphids. Aphids cause huge damage to plants by removing nutrients from them. While this approach employs management strategies that can be manipulated to disadvantage the invasive species, so its reproductive capacity or its ability to spread is reduced. For example, the damage caused by some invasive agricultural pests can be lessened by using crop varieties that are resistant to a plant disease.
Created using Powtoon.